March 3rd, 2007, Albuquerque, New Mexico. At exactly 5:30 p.m., realtor Jessica Hale unlocked the door of a brand new model home for a scheduled showing. Neighbors remembered the last image of her, greeting a man in a dark blazer and a woman in a striking red floral dress. Hours later, her portfolio and cell phone were found upstairs, abandoned like frozen evidence of a life cut short. Jessica never walked out of that home again. Her disappearance shook Albuquerque. Candlelight vigils lit the cul-de-sac, flyers plastered across the city, and fellow realtors changed their routines out of fear. Yet days turned to months, and months to years. The case went cold, filed away with no suspects, no answers, only silence. But nearly a decade later, technology revealed a chilling twist. The prepaid phone that lured Jessica had pinged near a property tied to powerful business associates, reopening the case and reigniting suspicion. What really happened inside that house in 2007? Who were the mystery couple that vanished into the night? Subscribe, follow, and turn on notifications, because some cold cases are more than unsolved mysteries. They are warnings, waiting for the truth to surface. March 2007 settled over Albuquerque the way dust settles on a window ledge, quietly, without asking permission. The evening light slipped off the Sandia Mountains in long copper ribbons, laying an expensive sheen across a new patch of suburb where the streets still smelled faintly of hot asphalt and fresh stucco. Sprinklers whispered across square lawns that had not yet learned the grit of summer. Street lamps warmed awake one by one, each bulb a small, careful promise that the night would be ordinary. Jessica Hale pulled into the cul-de-sac as if she owned the hour. She was 25. The kind of young professional who made you believe that hustle could make a home out of any map. The model house she'd come to open stood at the bend of a manicured loop, terracotta roof blushing under the last hit of daylight. She killed the engine, took a breath, and listened, a habit she had learned without calling it one. The neighborhood answered with mild suburban noises, a back screen door thumping, a dog's soft complaint behind a fence, the far tick-tick-tick of a cooling car. Somewhere back toward Tramway Boulevard, traffic sewed itself into a continuous, indifferent hum. She smoothed her skirt, reached for her leather portfolio, and stepped into the crisp air. The keys chimed in her hand as she crossed the walkway, stage lights for a one-woman show. The lock gave easily, clean and new, and the door swung open to a wash of conditioned air tinged with paint, new carpet, and a hint of citrus the stagers loved. Jessica flipped on lights in a practiced sequence. Entry, kitchen pendants, a line of recessed cans guiding a path down the hallway like runway beacons. The place was all promise. Granite counters with polite flecks of gold, deep sink under a window framing a slice of purple mountain, the kind of master bath that convinced people they could start over. She checked the time. 5:27 p.m. The appointment was for 5:30 with a couple who had called the office late, voices honeyed by urgency. The woman had sounded older than the man, voice softened and pinched at the corners by an accent Jessica couldn't place. They had asked for the most expensive homes on her list, and there was a way the man had laughed, as if the price were a compliment, not a number. Jessica had written the names into her notebook and underlined the address, a small mark of focus she didn't mention to anyone. One last pass. She nudged a throw pillow into plumpness, drew a bar stool an inch to the left to symmetrize the island, straightened a brochure stack. She checked her phone. Full battery, 2 missed calls from her mom at lunch, a text from Ryan. Good luck tonight. She typed back a quick thanks and slid the phone into the portfolio's inner sleeve, where she always kept it during showings. It made her feel more professional to have it there, out of sight but close, like a hidden safety net. Through the front window, the day thinned down to a glaze. A white sedan coasted up the street and paused at the stop sign for a breath longer than necessary, as if tasting the block. Then tires whispered, and the car moved on. Another glance up the road. Nothing. The faintest breeze pressed pebbles of sand along the curb, a moving seam of mica and grit. She walked the stairs, testing treads by habit, her heels soft on brand-new carpet. Upstairs, the master waited, cavernous and echo-clean, sunlight pouring through the west-facing windows in big rectangles that stretched and cooled as she stood there. She checked the closet, the bathroom, the secondary bedrooms, everything in place, everything untouched. She could have stayed in that light until it left the room entirely. Back downstairs, the deadbolt snicked as she secured the front door for the wait. She reached for her portfolio to review the comps one more time, then pivoted, listening again. It was a small thing, listening. It made you feel squared with the house, as if the place had a heartbeat and you were waiting to hear it skip. At 5:31, a car door thunked faintly from somewhere close. She peered through the side light. A dark-haired man straightened from the passenger side of a car parked just beyond her view, tall and buttoned into something that looked like money, the cloth pulling cleanly across his shoulders. The woman moved first, her dress a floral red that caught the smallest light and held it captive, a pattern that felt like a dare. The man followed, gait unhurried, eyes already measuring the property line, the roof line, the world. Jessica smiled because she always did. She opened the door wide enough for warmth to flow out and gestures to flow in. She introduced herself with the practiced ease of someone who had bridged 100 thresholds, then stepped back so the entry could do its sparkling. The woman's perfume arrived ahead of her, something sharp and exotic that snapped at the citrus in the air like two strings tightened on the same instrument. The man offered a nod, not his hand, and his eyes flicked. Not quite unfriendly, not quite anything. Over the console table, the bowl of staged keys, the bronze mirror that threw 3 bodies back at them. They moved through the first floor in the choreography of strangers learning a place. Jessica named features, laid out the architecture as if it were a biography, a series of good decisions. The woman asked a question about neighborhood noise, then another about the HOA. Her voice was smooth velvet pulled over a hard form. The man made a small remark about the lot size, drew a fingertip absently along the edge of the island, as if checking for dust. The contact left no smudge. He smiled without showing his teeth. Upstairs, the light had fallen into a thinner version of itself. The master bedroom windows framed a sky now more violet than copper. The sandiest growing shadowed ribs. The woman stood in the center of the room, her floral dress quieting against the beige carpet, and made a single slow turn, a ballerina's pivot for an audience of 2. Jessica tracked the movement, reminded herself to mention the closet's built-in shelves. The man lingered in the doorway, foot propped casually against the frame, and the pose made the door seem thinner than it was. Jessica's phone buzzed in the portfolio downstairs. She did not go to it, did not let the sound interrupt the presentation cadence she had shaped over the past year. She pointed out the depth of the tub, the privacy of the toilet room, the way the morning light would make the mirror honest. The woman asked if the neighborhood felt safe after dark, and smiled as she asked it, as if safety were a cheerful topic, a game adults played after dessert. Jessica said what agents said. The woman nodded, satisfied, eyes wandering with a kind of curiosity that did not belong to buyers. Something small went wrong with the air then. Maybe it was the way the man's gaze hardened, as if he had reached a decision about a price she had not yet named. Maybe it was the woman's hand, the way she smoothed the front of her dress like a prelude to something, palm flattening floral into silence. Or maybe it was the house itself, a model home built to embody ideal life, suddenly aware of its nakedness. Jessica felt a chord strike under the floorboards, a vibration her mind labeled as nonsense even as her body refused the label. She cleared her throat, asked if they'd like to see the secondary bedroom again, the one at the top of the stairs with the corner window and the little view of the cul-de-sac. The woman's smile held. The man's foot rolled off the frame. As they turned, Jessica clocked the hallway length, the distance to the stairs, the weight of her portfolio on the dresser where she had set it. She noted, unhelpfully, that she should never have put it down. She led and they followed, the three of them moving like notes in a line, the house swallowing their echoes door by door. At the landing, the overhead can lights made halos on the ceiling. A short, sharp sound cracked from outside, some neighbor's trunk or a child's dropped scooter, and Jessica flicked a glance through the stair window. The street lay picture calm. That long ribbon of new blacktop, those squared lawns, the thin line of mountain bleeding into night. When she looked back, the woman stood closer than before, the floral field of her dress filling more of the hallway. The man's hands were in his pockets. Jessica's heart ticked up to a noticeable speed, the kind of tempo you could mistake for excitement if you wanted to. There were so many sensible explanations. She told herself all of them at once. She told herself that nothing bad happens in a house built for open houses, under lights chosen by stagers, in a suburb that smelled like wet concrete and perseverance. She told herself that every instinct has a twin, and sometimes the anxious one lives louder. She told herself to smile again and did. Downstairs, a sprinkler cycled on with an obedient hiss. Somewhere, a porch light clicked, then another. The mountain shrugged deeper into the dark. Jessica named the final features, tucked her hands together, and stood in the master bedroom doorway as the couple looked around one last time. Eyes sliding along surfaces as if taking invisible fingerprints they intended to return. She thought about calling her mom back after this, about stopping for a latte even though it was too late for caffeine, about the text she'd send Ryan. The evening, in its narrow ways, still offered a path back to ordinary. Hours later, she would not walk out again. The keys that had chimed in her palm would sleep on the dresser with her phone, mute and indifferent. The house would keep its secrets the way new houses do, easily, with smooth walls and quiet corners. In the neighborhood, sprinklers would cycle off, yard lights would give up. The cul-de-sac would polish itself to a black, unremarkable shine, and somewhere above the sandias, the last of the day would vanish as if swallowed. Someone had set a perfect trap behind the smiling mask of a client, and the air had known it first. By the time the neighborhood folded into night, the house stood silent except for the low hum of its new HVACs and the faint creak of joists cooling. A model home is supposed to feel welcoming at any hour, yet past 9 o'clock, with no movement inside and no car parked in the drive, it seemed less like a promise and more like an abandoned stage set. A pair of porch lights threw tired halos across the stucco, insects orbiting in restless loops. And the cul-de-sac slouched into its usual hush. No one knew that inside those walls the showing had ended in a way no one had imagined. Jessica never texted back her boyfriend. She never called her mom. Her portfolio remained upstairs, splayed open on the dresser like a frozen gesture. The crisp brochures, once full of sales patter and potential, now looked stranded, their tidy pages meaningless in the sudden vacuum of her absence. The scent of citrus and new carpet lingered like a cover-up. When midnight came, a security light on the neighbor's house flickered on, startled by nothing visible. The white sedan that had circled earlier in the evening was gone. Only the echo of its tires, the soft groove left in memory, remained. The next morning, the desert sun rose blunt and merciless. Its light did what light always does. It washed over everything without discrimination, touching playground slides, cracked sidewalks, mountain ridges, and one house with a lock that now held secrets. The neighbors noticed little. A retired teacher across the street rolled his garbage bin to the curb and glanced at the model home, noting the absence of the agent's car, but thinking nothing of it. People came and went all the time from those places. By mid-morning, landscapers moved along the block, their leaf blowers whining like saws, dust spinning in small tornadoes across the asphalt. Jessica's phone continued to buzz on the dresser upstairs. Calls from her mom multiplied. Ryan's texts stacked, the tone shifting from casual encouragement to questions, then to worry edged with impatience. At 11 a.m., the office receptionist left a voicemail, crisp and professional, asking if she had closed the showing successfully. By 2 o'clock, concern hardened into suspicion. Jessica never missed check-ins. She never ignored calls. Ryan drove out to the subdivision around 3. He knew her routines. He knew the neighborhoods she covered. He parked at the curb and stepped out, shielding his eyes against the pale desert glare. The model home looked normal. Too normal. The lockbox hung in place on the door. The windows were bright with mid-afternoon sunlight, and the landscaping remained prim. He rang the bell, waited, then knocked harder. The silence behind the door was thicker than he expected, as though the walls were stuffed with it. When he circled the house, peering through windows, he caught only sterile views of staged furniture, a sofa with untouched throw pillows, a dining table set for a dinner that would never come. He pressed his forehead against the glass and called her name, softly at first, then louder, the sound bouncing back at him in short, useless bursts. By evening, her absence could no longer be bent into excuses. The police were notified. Officers arrived, clipped and deliberate, their radios murmuring with static. The lockbox gave way to their tools. When the door swung open, they stepped into air that felt too cool, too prepared. A space that bore no obvious violence but somehow reeked of wrongness. They moved cautiously, scanning each room, noting the neatness, the absence of signs of struggle. But upstairs, the portfolio caught their attention. The phone still lay inside, screen dark, buzzing only when another call came through. A half-empty bottle of water stood on the dresser, condensation long gone. No body, no note, no struggle, only absence, framed by immaculate walls. The investigation began the way all investigations do. Timelines constructed, phone records pulled, witness lists formed. The receptionist recounted the call from a couple who had asked for a showing at the last minute, voices she could not place afterward. Ryan described the names written in Jessica's notebook, names that now looked like fiction. Neighbors remembered a car, or thought they did, details slipping sideways under the heat of questions. One said it was white, another thought silver. One insisted it was a sedan, another a crossover. Detectives studied the house again and again. They crouched at the threshold, examining scuffs near the door that could have been left by anyone. They dusted for prints, finding mostly Jessica's. The brochures bore faint smears that resisted identification. A single long strand of dark hair was recovered from the upstairs bathroom, but whether it belonged to the unknown woman or had floated in with the air currents, no one could say. Her disappearance made the evening news by the second day. Reporters parked vans at the entrance of the subdivision, cameras aimed at the house like lenses on a crime scene exhibit. The story spread with its easy hooks. Young realtor, last showing, vanished without a trace. Viewers watched grainy footage of Jessica smiling in her headshot, her professional pose suddenly eerie in hindsight. Behind the scenes, detectives followed what little they had. They subpoenaed cell tower data, scoured traffic cams along Tramway Boulevard, and replayed hours of footage from gas stations within a 5-mile radius. They learned nothing about the couple's names. They traced Jessica's car, but found it parked neatly outside her own apartment, untouched. The case acquired a pressure of its own, building weight each day she failed to return. Friends organized search parties, combing arroyos and hiking trails where the desert swallowed evidence quickly. Flyers stapled to telephone poles wilted in the heat. Her photo repeated until it blurred into background noise. Social media filled with speculation, theories offered by strangers who built entire narratives from fragments. Inside the precinct, detectives re-examined the timeline. Someone had called the office. Someone had known Jessica would be at that model home alone. Someone had watched her enough to plan. The house became less a crime scene than a message board, each staged room a sentence half-written, the final punctuation withheld. By the end of the week, the trail had cooled to ash. The lock was changed, the house sealed. Prospective buyers passed it by, uneasy about a property whispered about on the news, yet the place still stood at the cul-de-sac's bend, porch lights clicking on at dusk as if nothing were wrong. The desert wind scraped grit across the curb, and the mountain shadows rolled down like always. But something lingered in those walls, something heavier than silence. An unfinished story, waiting for its next page to turn. The search for Jessica Hale deepened into something heavier than a missing persons case. By the third week, the initial shock had hardened into dread. Flyers curled at their edges on community boards. Faces of strangers stopped at traffic lights, stared from posters taped to utility poles. And local talk radio recited theories until they bled into rumor. What once had been a hopeful hunt shifted into an exercise in persistence. Detectives caught between dwindling leads and the pressure of silence. Detective Mark Kincaid sat in his car outside the subdivision one late evening, watching the model home. The place remained staged but empty, its lawn maintained by contract landscapers, its porch lights glowing dutifully at dusk. He had walked through it more times than he cared to count, each time searching for something he had missed, each time exiting with the same sour taste in his mouth. A house could lie by omission, he thought. It could withhold the smallest truths without effort. The forensics report had given them little to lean on. The strand of hair was too degraded for quick analysis. Fingerprints matched mostly Jessica's, a few smudges too partial to categorize. Shoe impressions by the back patio door were indistinct, as if someone had lingered in half-light and then swept their presence away with the dry desert air. Kincaid replayed the call to the realty office again and again. The voices had been recorded, tinny on the system. A man and a woman, polite but direct, their tone carrying a rehearsed quality. Experts analyzed the recording but could not tie it to known suspects, Voice recognition databases came up empty. What struck him most wasn't the words, but the pauses, the small beats of silence that made it sound less like curiosity and more like a script. Meanwhile, Jessica's family grew restless. Her mother's tears appeared on nightly broadcasts, her father speaking in clipped sentences about hope and justice. Ryan, her boyfriend, haunted the precinct with questions that detectives had no good answers for. His grief came wrapped in frustration, a mix that strained every conversation. Still, Kincaid pressed on. He visited the cul-de-sac at odd hours, sat in his car, and watched the ebb and flow of the neighborhood. He interviewed neighbors who had already spoken to police twice. He asked about the white sedan, about unusual visitors, about anyone watching from a distance. Most responses blurred together, vague recollections distorted by time. One neighbor swore the man who stepped out of the car wore a dark blazer. Another insisted it was casual attire. The woman's dress was described in 3 different colors, only one matching Jessica's original notes. Memory was pliable, and the desert heat stretched it thinner with every passing day. By the 4th week, the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force lent support. They combed financial records, cross-referenced missing persons databases, studied the patterns of predator cases in similar suburban settings. Yet even with federal resources, no clear trail emerged. Jessica had vanished in the span of an ordinary evening, leaving behind only a staged house that refused to confess. Kincaid considered the psychology. If it was a targeted abduction, then someone had studied her. Realtors worked alone in empty houses, meeting strangers by design. It was a profession built on trust, and predators could exploit that. But what haunted him was the deliberate nature of it, the choice of the model home, the precision of timing, the absence of forensic chaos. It did not feel impulsive. It felt rehearsed. He began tracing Jessica's recent listings, studying her schedule for patterns. Most of her clients checked out: couples, retirees, young families. But the last-minute request that had drawn her to that house had bypassed normal channels. No one at the office could verify the couple beyond that single call. It was as though they had risen from nowhere and returned to it, carrying her with them. At night, Kincaid found himself pacing the precinct's evidence room. The portfolio sat sealed in a clear bag, her phone still inside, battery long dead. He imagined the buzz of unanswered calls on that night, vibrating against the wood dresser upstairs, each one a lifeline cut short. He imagined her walking through the rooms with those strangers, pointing out granite counters and closet space while her instincts whispered warnings too quiet to act on. The press began calling it the realtor case. Headlines angled toward sensationalism. The house that swallowed her, vanished at closing time. Cable networks picked it up, producing slick segments with drone shots of the subdivision. Ominous music laid over slow pans of the model home. Armchair detectives online dissected her social media, her smile in photographs, the curve of her handwriting in the notebook left behind. Everyone wanted to solve the puzzle from a distance, but inside the investigation room, the pieces refused to lock. As summer pressed forward, heat waves shimmered above asphalt, and hope thinned in the dry air. Kincaid still drove past the cul-de-sac when his shift ended, parking under the shade of a lone mesquite to watch the staged house breathe through the night. He could not shake the feeling that the walls were holding something invisible, a residue of whatever had happened within. He told himself that every case left ghosts. Some were simply louder. Back at the station, case files piled high. He reviewed them in loops, each revisit sharpening details others overlooked. One note nagged at him. A neighbor had reported hearing a sound like a trunk slamming around 9:15 that night. Dismissed as routine noise but paired with the absence of Jessica's car, it suggested she might have been moved quickly, efficiently. He leaned on that detail, pressing it into a theory. The couple could have arrived in one vehicle, left in another staged nearby. They could have used the model home as a lure, then transported her before anyone realized she was missing. The cold logic of it gnawed at him, because it meant they had planned more than just a meeting. They had planned for disappearance. Weeks became months. Leads dried up. The subdivision sold more homes. Families moved in. Children chalked hopscotch grids on sidewalks just yards from where Jessica had last been seen. Life inched forward, relentless. But every new resident carried the story in whispers. At block parties, they spoke of that house, their voices lowering even as they laughed. The staged home eventually sold, though no one could scrub the stain it carried. Detective Kincaid carried it too. Every case leaves something behind, and this one left him with a house that lived in his mind like a question with no answer. He knew the story wasn't over. He knew silence is only a pause, not an ending. Somewhere, the truth waited in shadows, biding its time to surface. And Jessica, whether alive or gone, lingered in that pause. A ghost of a smile in a photograph, a voice lost in the static of a recorded call, a presence that refused to be erased by the desert's indifference. By the time autumn rolled into Albuquerque, the subdivision no longer smelled like fresh stucco and cut sod. Dust had begun to gather along the edges of driveways, weeds pried through sidewalk cracks, and the once pristine lawns reflected the quiet neglect of families settling into routines. The new neighborhood was alive now. Garage doors groaned at dawn. Children left bicycles tipped in driveways. Porch lights stayed on later as nights stretched longer. Yet beneath the normal rhythms lay something raw and unsettled. Everyone knew this was the neighborhood where a realtor had vanished without explanation. Detective Mark Kincaid felt it whenever he drove into the cul-de-sac. Curtains shifted when his car passed. Conversations paused on porches. Parents kept an eye on their children as if predators might still be circling. The subdivision had been built to symbolize safety and prosperity, but now it wore a second identity. A place where the line between ordinary life and horror had dissolved. Inside the precinct, the realtor case sat stacked in boxes against the wall of Kincaid's office. Reports, interviews, forensic summaries, they had grown into a monument of unanswered questions. Months of work, and the trail remained cold. Yet he couldn't let it go. It wasn't just professional duty anymore. It was personal, an itch under his skin that refused to fade. He poured himself into patterns. Night after night, he reconstructed the timeline, compared witness accounts, tracked every vehicle seen near the subdivision on March 15th. Traffic cams showed countless cars, but one clip haunted him. A blurry white sedan cruising slowly past the entrance at 5:22 p.m., headlights already on though the sun was still setting. The license plate was unreadable, the driver faceless. But it was the only constant in the shifting accounts of neighbors, and that made it matter. Kincaid also pressed into Jessica's personal life. He studied her texts, her voicemails, her appointments in the weeks before she vanished. Nothing pointed to someone planning to hurt her. No debts, no secret enemies. She was steady, ambitious, grounded. It sharpened the theory that the danger had come from outside her world, not within it, a predator who had chosen her for her profession, her vulnerability in empty houses, not for who she was. Ryan, her boyfriend, tried to keep her story alive. He organized candlelight vigils outside the model home. Dozens of people gathered with candles trembling against the desert wind, their voices cracking as they prayed, as if sound could pierce the silence that had swallowed her. News crews filmed every flickering light, every tearful plea. But behind the emotion was the same cold void. No evidence surfaced. No body was found. The community felt the weight. Realtors across the city changed their routines. They refused late appointments, insisted on bringing partners to showings, carried pepper spray in their bags. Some even left the profession altogether, unable to square the risk with the reward. The real estate board issued warnings, reminders, safety seminars, but none of it erased the image of Jessica's smile on missing posters, a face frozen in time. As weeks bled into months, whispers thickened. Some neighbors said the house was cursed. Others claimed they'd heard strange noises in the night, a door shutting when no one was inside, footsteps echoing across tile floors long after the place had been sold to a cautious young couple. Rational minds dismissed it as imagination, but unease clung to the block. Children dared each other to bike past the house after dark, pedaling hard and laughing too loudly as they escaped the shadow of its walls. Detective Kincaid kept circling back. One evening, he sat parked at the corner, headlights off, engine idling low. He watched as the new owners carried groceries inside, their movements ordinary, unaware, or perhaps determined not to think, of the story etched into their walls. He pictured Jessica walking those same hallways with her portfolio in hand, her voice echoing brightly as she pitched the features. And then he pictured the silence that followed, the air collapsing in on itself as if the house had swallowed her whole. The pressure of unsolved cases gnawed at him. Colleagues urged him to step back, to accept that not every mystery yields to persistence. But he couldn't. Each night he returned to the evidence files, scanning them until the words blurred. He read and reread the note from the receptionist about the couple's unusual questions, the call that had been polite but slightly off, the hesitation that no one had paid attention to at first. He replayed the recorded voices, letting the silences between words crawl under his skin. Sometimes, late at night, he drove past the desert arroyos where search teams had combed months earlier. The sand had long since erased footprints, brush reclaimed paths cut by volunteers, and coyotes moved freely where people had once marched with flashlights. Out there, the desert was patient. It kept secrets in plain sight, waiting for rain or erosion or accident to bring them back to light. For Kincaid, the desert mirrored the case itself. Vast, silent, merciless. You could search every inch and still miss what mattered, yet he couldn't stop searching. As fall deepened, media interest began to fade. Other stories crowded the airwaves, but in the cul-de-sac, the sense of fracture never healed. Residents locked their doors earlier. Strangers drew suspicion. Even the sound of a trunk closing late at night carried an edge of menace. The realtor case had become more than a missing person file. It was a scar across the neighborhood, a shadow over every open house in the city. And for Kincaid, it was the echo of a woman's last walk through a model home, her smile flickering in and out of reach, her story trapped in silence that refused to break. He knew one truth more than any other. Whoever had taken Jessica was still out there, watching, waiting, confident enough to vanish into the ordinary, ruthless enough to leave nothing behind but absence. And that truth, more than the silence of the desert or the chill of the staged home, was what kept him awake long after the city had gone to sleep. Winter in Albuquerque came not with snow but with a hard clarity. The mountains sharpened at dusk, their ridges cut darker against the sky, and the desert air turned brittle, carrying every sound a little too far. By December, Jessica Hale's disappearance had settled into the city's consciousness like an unscratchable itch. Most residents had accepted it as one of those cases that might never be solved, filed mentally alongside other local mysteries that lived only in memory and rumor. But Detective Mark Kincaid couldn't let it rest. The case followed him into every quiet space of his life. The empty moments in the car, the silence of his kitchen late at night, even the rhythm of his morning coffee. He had worked homicides before, cases with blood and bodies, grief and closure. But this one was different. It was absence without answer, a story that refused its ending. The model home, now occupied by the young couple who had purchased it in the fall, stood like an unwanted landmark. They kept curtains drawn most of the time, as if to shield themselves from the eyes of neighbors who still glanced too long. When real estate agents held open houses elsewhere in the subdivision, prospective buyers always asked the same question in lowered voices. Is this near where the realtor disappeared? It was as if the house itself had rewritten the geography of the neighborhood, drawing an invisible line between before and after. Kincaid spent his evenings revisiting the evidence files, though his colleagues warned him about obsession. He studied the call records from the night of Jessica's last showing, circling again and again around the mystery couple's phone number. It traced back to a prepaid cell, purchased in cash at a convenience store near I-40. Surveillance footage from the store showed a man in a baseball cap buying cigarettes, gum, and the phone. His face remained angled away from the camera, a casual avoidance that suggested practice. It was the only tangible glimpse of someone connected to the case, yet it yielded nothing else. The FBI analysts had constructed profiles, educated guesses more than anything. They spoke of planning, control, predator behavior. A couple working together suggested something rare, either a symbiotic criminal partnership or one person manipulating the other. Theories, however, did not find people. What gnawed at Kincaid was how clean the scene had been. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Jessica's portfolio upstairs, her phone inside, her car untouched outside her apartment. Whoever had taken her had done so without leaving behind chaos. That level of control meant preparation. It meant patience. In early January, Ryan showed up at the precinct again. Grief had hollowed him. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, his words edged with bitterness. He pressed for updates, demanded to know what progress had been made, and accused the department of letting the trail grow cold. Kincaid listened quietly, offering only the thin truth. They had leads, but nothing concrete. Ryan left in frustration, his anger echoing long after the door shut. The city moved on outwardly, but under the surface the case festered. Online forums dedicated entire threads to Jessica's disappearance. Amateur sleuths proposed theories ranging from serial predators to human trafficking rings, each one more elaborate than the last. A few even targeted Ryan himself, dissecting his interviews, his body language, his every word, as if grief could be evidence. One night, unable to sleep, Kincaid drove back to the cul-de-sac. He parked in his usual spot and stared at the house, its porch light glowing weak against the desert dark. He imagined again the sequence of that night. Jessica welcoming the couple, leading them through polished rooms, her smile steady but her instincts whispering something she hadn't said aloud. He pictured the moment everything turned, though no evidence showed where or how. He let the silence press against him until he almost believed he could hear it. The click of a lock, the slam of a trunk, the sound of someone breathing too close. The desert wind rattled a loose gutter on a nearby roof. The sound jolted him, reminding him that time had not stopped, even if the case felt frozen. He scribbled notes in his pad. Trunk noise at 9:15 p.m. White sedan, prepaid phone purchase, couple rehearsed voices. The same fragments, rearranged, hoping for a pattern to emerge. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture. Some residents spoke openly of selling and leaving. Others leaned harder into safety measures. Cameras mounted above garages, motion lights installed, neighborhood watch signs hammered into lawns. But these were surface remedies. The deeper wound was trust. The subdivision had been built on the promise of security. Yet Jessica's disappearance proved that safety could be an illusion, stripped away in the span of a single evening. Kincaid felt it too. He carried his badge, his weapon, his training, but even he felt the edges of vulnerability. He thought of Jessica as more than a case file now. She was a presence that haunted the city's collective conscience. He imagined her family at their dinner table, her empty chair, the phone calls unanswered. He imagined Ryan's restless nights, the sound of the apartment too big without her. And he imagined the perpetrators, whoever they were, walking freely through the world, confident they had buried their crime in silence. But silence has a way of breaking. Secrets do not stay buried forever. And Kincaid knew, deep in the place where instincts are born, that cracks would appear. Someone would slip, a detail would surface. The desert might give something back. Until then, the realtor case remained what it had become. Not just an unsolved mystery, but a mirror held up to the city. It showed how fragile ordinary life was, how quickly trust could fracture, and how absence could weigh heavier than any presence. As winter winds swept grit along the empty sidewalks, Kincaid promised himself one thing. He would not let the case die, no matter how long it took. Somewhere in the silence, Jessica's story was still waiting for its ending, and he would keep listening for it, even if it whispered through the years like desert wind against glass. By February, nearly a year after Jessica Hale vanished, the city had folded the story into its background hum. Headlines no longer carried her photo every night. Search parties had dwindled. The vigils stopped drawing cameras. Life had a way of moving forward, whether people wanted it to or not. But Detective Mark Kincaid never stopped circling the case. The files were thick, dog-eared from his constant handling. He had memorized the photographs, the staged living room with its untouched throw pillows, the granite counters gleaming under soft pendant light, the dresser upstairs where Jessica's phone had been found silent. Each detail had become etched into his mind like a scar. He carried them with him everywhere, unable to file them away as others had done. Then a thread appeared, so thin it might have been dismissed. A retired mail carrier, sorting through old receipts at his kitchen table, remembered something. Months before, on the evening of Jessica's disappearance, he had stopped for gas at a station near the I-40 on-ramp. He recalled a car, white, maybe cream-colored, parked awkwardly at the edge of the lot. What caught his attention was not the car itself, but the woman inside. She had been in the passenger seat, dark hair falling across her face, sitting rigidly. He could not be certain, but when he saw Jessica's missing posters weeks later, a chill had run through him. He never spoke of it, telling himself memory could play tricks. But as the anniversary neared, guilt pried it out of him. He called the tip line. Kincaid drove straight to the man's house. The carrier's description was hesitant, blurred by time. But it struck like a match against kindling. The gas station had cameras. They might have archived footage. Most businesses erased tapes after a few months, but sometimes anomalies survived. It was worth trying. The station's manager dug into an old hard drive. Dust lay thick across the metal casing, the files nearly corroded by neglect. Yet among them, footage surfaced, grainy, time-stamped March 15, 2007. At 9:14 p.m., a white sedan nosed into frame, headlights cutting a sharp glare. The angle was poor, the image fractured by glare and pixelation. Still, the outline was clear. A man pumping gas, another figure in the passenger seat. The woman's face was turned away, blurred by reflection. Yet her posture, shoulders stiff, body angled like a figure braced against something unseen, sent a ripple through Kincaid. The man, tall, dark hair under a baseball cap, moved with casual efficiency. He swiped a card, filled the tank, then glanced once toward the camera. That glance froze Kincaid where he sat. Not because the face was clear, it wasn't, but because the movement carried a kind of confidence, as though he knew how to exist half in shadow. It was the first new piece of evidence in months. It shifted the case from suffocating stillness into fragile momentum. Analysts scrubbed the footage, enhancing frames, but the quality fought them. The sedan might have been a Toyota or a Nissan, maybe early 2000s. The plate was unreadable. Still, the timeline tightened. Jessica's last known moments now stretched beyond the house, into the city's restless arteries. The discovery reignited public interest. Local news stations replayed the clip, looping the blurry image of the car pulling away. Talk radio chewed over theories, voices loud with certainty. Online forums dissected every frame, some insisting the passenger was Jessica, others dismissing it as coincidence. For her family, the footage brought both hope and torment. Hope that she had survived those first hours. Torment that she might have been alive, visible, and still lost. Kincaid knew better than to let a lead inflate beyond its weight. Yet he could not ignore the feeling that the case had shifted. The perpetrators were not ghosts. They had driven through the city that night, fueled their car like anyone else, left behind a digital trace on a gas station hard drive. That meant they were fallible. That meant they could slip. He pulled maps, tracing routes from the subdivision to the station, then outward toward highways that braided into the desert. Each route offered possibilities: north toward Santa Fe, east into Texas, south toward Mexico. The vastness made him grind his teeth. A single night, a dozen roads, and Jessica could have been carried anywhere. Still, he pressed the new lead into the larger pattern. The prepaid phone bought days before. The couple rehearsed in their politeness, the white sedan drifting through witness accounts like a ghost. The gas station footage was not a solution, but it was proof. They had been real, flesh and bone, not just voices on a recorder. Weeks stretched as analysts pursued the car, comparing it against DMV records, cross-checking similar vehicles reported stolen or abandoned. Nothing immediate surfaced, but Kincaid felt the tide shifting. The silence was cracking. At night, he still drove to the cul-de-sac, watching the model home where it had begun. The young couple living there rarely came outside. He couldn't blame them. A house with that kind of history cast a shadow across every dinner, every quiet night. Yet as he sat parked under the street lamp, he no longer felt only the weight of failure. He felt a faint hum, the sense of a thread pulling taut. The desert was patient, but even the desert could not hide everything. Somewhere, beyond the reach of cul-de-sacs and porch lights, Jessica's story still waited. And now, finally, a piece of it had slipped free of the dark. Kincaid swore he would not let it vanish again. He leaned into the case harder, letting the pressure grow, knowing that pressure cracks even the most careful masks. And whoever had orchestrated Jessica Hale's disappearance had worn their mask too long. Spring brought warm winds that swept the grit from Albuquerque streets, but the realtor case stayed heavy in the air. A year had passed since Jessica Hale vanished, and her name had begun to fade from headlines again. Families moved into the subdivision. New children laughed on sidewalks, and porch lights flicked on with the same dutiful rhythm. Yet beneath it all, her absence remained. A bruise beneath the surface, tender to anyone who pressed too hard. Detective Mark Kincaid lived with that bruise. He carried the gas station footage in his mind like a splinter he couldn't dig out. Grainy though it was, the image of that white sedan at 9:14 p.m. haunted him. The man filling the tank, the shadow of a passenger slumped stiff in the seat, the car pulling away into darkness. It was proof Jessica had left the subdivision alive, proof she'd been carried deeper into the night. But proof without a destination felt like torture. Kincaid spent long nights mapping out highways again, tracing the routes the car could have taken. North through Santa Fe, where cameras grew sparse along the interstate. South toward Las Cruces and the border, east into Texas, west into Arizona. Each road opened like a vein into endless possibility. He pushed pins into maps, drew red threads between gas stations, rest stops, and towns with failing cameras. The map became a web, sprawling across his office wall, yet it told him nothing he didn't already know. She had been moved, and the desert was vast enough to swallow anyone whole. The FBI analysts pushed forward too, scouring vehicle databases, filtering thousands of white sedans by year, make, and model. They came back with lists so long they blurred into uselessness. Kincaid pressed harder, asking them to cross-check with prepaid phone purchases, credit card transactions, motel check-ins. The work stretched resources thin. Each query ended with more questions than answers. The silence gnawed at Jessica's family most of all. Her mother grew frailer under the weight of not knowing, her father stiffer, speaking only in fragments when reporters came. Ryan, the boyfriend, carried his grief like armor. He still called the precinct, though less often now, his voice dulled by exhaustion. He had stopped asking, "When will you find her?" and had started asking, "Will you ever?" The community fractured further. Some neighbors refused to talk about the case at all, insisting silence was the only way to move forward. Others whispered theories over fences, each one more elaborate than the last. Children dared one another to knock on the door of the haunted house, their laughter nervous, echoing too loudly. The new owners lived quietly, rarely speaking to neighbors, as if they could outlast the shadow by pretending it wasn't there. But for Kincaid, silence was the enemy. He refused to let the case dissolve into myth. He combed through tips that trickled in still, sightings of women resembling Jessica in small towns, rumors of a couple traveling under false names. Most were dead ends, yet he followed each one, driving hours into the desert, only to return with nothing but dust on his tires. One night, parked outside the subdivision again, he thought about the predators who had orchestrated this. They had rehearsed their roles, perfected their politeness, chosen their moment with precision. They had carried Jessica out of her life with such control that even now, more than a year later, the trail was a smear of shadows. Yet control is brittle, he reminded himself. It cracks under time. People make mistakes. Secrets slip. He thought of the prepaid phone bought in cash, the blurry figure under a baseball cap. He thought of the woman's floral dress, described differently by each neighbor, as if designed to confuse memory itself. He thought of Jessica's phone vibrating uselessly upstairs, messages piling up until the battery went dark. Every detail spoke of planning. But planning required practice. Somewhere, he believed, this was not the first time. That theory took root. He began digging into unsolved cases across the Southwest, looking for women who had vanished under similar circumstances, alone, at night, from spaces meant to be safe. He found patterns, faint echoes. A realtor in Arizona, never confirmed missing, but who quit abruptly after reporting a threatening encounter. A woman in Texas who disappeared after meeting strangers from a classified ad. Stories scattered like bones in the sand. The desert had always been good at swallowing things, but Kincaid knew patterns never stayed buried forever. He let the possibility settle heavy in his chest. Jessica's case might be part of something larger, something that stretched across states, hidden in plain sight. He worked alone most nights, long after others left the precinct. He shuffled papers until the words blurred, rewound footage until the static hummed in his ears. Exhaustion weighed on him, but obsession carried him forward. He thought of Jessica not just as a victim, but as a voice silenced mid-sentence. He wanted to hear what that sentence would have been. By spring's end, the trail had not yet cracked open, but the pressure had shifted. A year of silence had turned the case into legend, but legends carry weight. They breed whispers, they stir memory, they make careless people talk. Somewhere, someone who had crossed paths with that couple still held a piece of truth, and Kincaid believed time would make them slip. Until then, he carried the silence, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. He carried the desert's patience, too, knowing that secrets rot eventually. And he carried Jessica's absence most of all, a hollow space that demanded an answer. The realtor case had not ended. It had only gone quiet, and silence, Kincaid told himself, was never permanent. Summer returned with its dry heat pressing down on Albuquerque, the air sharp with dust and sunlight that seemed to bleach the city into exhaustion. By then, Jessica Hale's disappearance had become less a case and more a legend, spoken of in lowered voices, folded into the city's folklore. But for Detective Mark Kincaid, it remained a wound that refused to close. The gas station footage still sat on his desk, frozen on the blurred image of the white sedan. He watched it again and again, as if repetition could coax out a detail he had missed. Each viewing left him restless, pacing the precinct, scribbling notes that went nowhere. Yet he refused to surrender the thought that somewhere in that footage lay the fracture, the tiny crack in the mask that would eventually split wide open. His theory about a larger pattern had taken root. He combed through national databases, searching for disappearances that echoed Jessica's. Realtors, nurses, women who met strangers through work or classified ads. Too many cases ended the same way. Silence, no body, no answers. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Jessica's abduction had not been an isolated act, but part of something practiced, perhaps even ritualized. It was around this time that a second thread appeared. A woman in Arizona reached out after seeing Jessica's face on an anniversary news segment. She told of a showing she had hosted in Phoenix the previous year. A couple had arrived, polite, professional, dressed as if they were serious buyers. The man asked pointed questions about the structure of the home, the woman about security and neighborhood safety. Something about their voices had unsettled her, though she couldn't say why. The showing ended without incident, but the memory had lingered. When she saw Jessica's story, recognition struck her like a blow. Kincaid drove down to Phoenix to interview her. She described the man as tall, dark-haired, carrying himself with a deliberate ease. The woman wore a patterned dress, her smile practiced, almost rehearsed. It was nearly identical to the Albuquerque couple. That testimony solidified his belief that the predators had a method. They moved city to city, targeting women in vulnerable professions, hiding behind the guise of normalcy. They rehearsed their parts until they blended seamlessly into expectation. But every performance leaves traces. He had to find them. Back in Albuquerque, he pushed deeper into Jessica's files. He re-examined her schedule from the weeks before she vanished, looking for anomalies. One appointment stood out: a canceled showing at another property across town. The caller had given a name that was later found to be false, the number disconnected. He had dismissed it months ago as coincidence. Now he saw it as rehearsal. They had circled her before, tested the waters, and chosen their moment with care. The realization sickened him. Jessica hadn't been unlucky. She had been hunted. Meanwhile, tension grew within the precinct. His colleagues began to tire of the case's weight, urging him to step back, to focus on fresh investigations with solvable outcomes. But Kincaid couldn't. The realtor case consumed him. Every time he thought of letting it go, he saw Jessica's mother clutching her daughter's photograph, Ryan's hollow eyes, the silence of the model home with its untouched portfolio. He could not walk away. One evening, restless, he returned to the subdivision. He parked under the same street lamp and stared at the house where it had begun. The new owners had settled in, curtains drawn, porch lights steady, yet he felt the same vibration in the air. The sense that the house carried memory like a scar. He imagined Jessica leading the couple through those bright rooms, her voice warm as she pointed out features, her instincts whispering warnings too faint to heed. He imagined the moment when the mask slipped, when the couple's politeness hardened into something colder. The silence pressed down on him until he nearly believed he could hear it. The click of the lock, the shuffle of footsteps, the car door shutting too softly. He gripped the steering wheel and promised himself he would not let that silence be the final word. As summer dragged on, the case showed tiny fractures. A traffic cam in southern New Mexico flagged a white sedan matching the grainy image from the gas station. The footage was weeks old by the time it surfaced, useless for capture, but it confirmed movement. The car had not stayed in Albuquerque. It had fled into the wider desert, blending into the anonymity of highways that cut across emptiness. It wasn't much, but it was proof that the predators had kept moving. And people who keep moving leave trails, no matter how faint. Kincaid built his board higher, maps and photos spreading across his office like an infection. He marked each city where a woman had vanished, each report of a suspicious couple, each thread of evidence. The pattern was undeniable now. What had begun as a single case had grown into something larger, something that stretched across state lines like a shadow. The realtor case was no longer just about Jessica Hale. It was about predators who believed they could erase women from their own lives and vanish into the ordinary. But ordinary has cracks, and Kincaid knew cracks widen. As August heat bore down, he felt closer than ever. He couldn't yet see the ending, but he could sense its shape. A mask slipping, a mistake made, a thread that would unravel everything. Until then, he carried the silence, heavy but not final, waiting for the moment it would shatter. By the second autumn after Jessica Hale vanished, the desert had cycled through another year of extremes. Searing heat, sudden storms, cold nights that burned the lungs, and still no one had found her. To the public, her case was beginning to fossilize into myth. But Detective Mark Kincaid's office told a different story. Its walls were smothered in maps, photographs, and red threads strung like arteries across the plaster. Every new tip, no matter how thin, was pinned there. He lived inside the case as if it were a second skin. The lead from Phoenix still rang in his mind. Another realtor, another couple, the same rehearsed politeness, the same sharp questions about security. And now whispers had started to surface elsewhere. Rumors from Texas, fragments from Nevada. It was as if the predators had left faint fingerprints on every desert state, each one invisible until viewed in sequence. Jessica's disappearance was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger pattern, a performance repeated with unnerving precision. That knowledge changed how Kincaid viewed the footage of the white sedan. He no longer saw it as just one car in one night. He saw it as a traveling stage, a capsule for predators moving city to city, hunting under the mask of ordinary life. The grainy image of the man pumping gas and the rigid passenger in the front seat became a symbol, not just of Jessica's last trace, but of every woman who had been drawn into that silent script. Yet predators who keep moving always leave cracks, and cracks had begun to show. It started with a call from Las Cruces. A state trooper, reviewing old reports, had noticed a pattern. Weeks after Jessica's disappearance, a motel clerk had filed a vague complaint about a couple traveling under aliases. The man had paid in cash, avoided eye contact, and insisted on a ground-floor room near the exit. The woman with him seemed quiet, almost too quiet, and when the clerk made small talk, the man had answered for her. Nothing had come of it at the time, but when the trooper read the old file against Jessica's case, unease bloomed. He forwarded it to Kincaid. The motel's security tapes were long erased, but the registration card remained. The names written were obvious fakes, yet the handwriting revealed something. The man's script was practiced, almost mechanical, but the woman's shaky scrawl suggested hesitation. For the first time, there was evidence that the woman might not be a full accomplice, but perhaps a participant under duress. That idea unsettled Kincaid deeply. If the pair were not equal partners, then the mask was even more fragile than he thought. He built the theory cautiously, layering details. The woman's strange smile during Jessica's showing, the questions about safety asked in a tone almost mocking, the floral dress that seemed more costume than clothing. What if she, too, was trapped in some twisted performance? What if the predators were not a perfect pair, but a broken equation, one dominating the other? That imbalance could be the fracture point. While Kincaid pursued this angle, the community in Albuquerque continued to live under the shadow. The subdivision where Jessica vanished had grown. More homes filled, more children played on sidewalks. Yet whispers persisted. New families asked about the realtor house, and longtime residents avoided answering. Some nights, teenagers gathered at the cul-de-sac, daring each other to knock on the door, their laughter forced and brittle. The house had become a landmark of fear. Jessica's family, meanwhile, struggled with the endless waiting. Her mother's health declined. Her father's words grew clipped, each public appearance shorter than the last. Ryan carried his grief like a storm cloud. He rarely came to the precinct anymore, but when he did, his presence weighed heavily in the room. He asked fewer questions now, but the silence between his words spoke louder than anger. Through it all, Kincaid pressed forward. He returned to the prepaid phone purchased days before Jessica vanished. He traced similar purchases across the region, comparing dates to suspicious reports. Slowly, a map emerged, not of one crime, but of a circuit, a route where disappearances and near misses lined up with the couple's movements. Albuquerque, Phoenix, Las Cruces, Amarillo. A trail across the desert, marked by silence. It was then that another fracture appeared. A mechanic in Amarillo contacted authorities after watching a documentary segment about Jessica's case. Months earlier, a man had brought in a white sedan with a damaged bumper. He paid in cash, refused to leave a phone number, and stood too close while the mechanic worked. What stuck in the mechanic's mind was the woman with him. She had lingered by the waiting area, staring at the door as if measuring the distance. When he offered her water, the man had answered for her, sharp enough to end the exchange. The mechanic couldn't swear it was the same couple, but Kincaid felt the weight of recognition, the same rehearsed control. The same silence pressed on the woman, another point on the map, another thread woven into the pattern. The predator's mask was slipping. They had survived by rehearsing politeness, by hiding in plain sight, by moving before suspicion could take root. But movement left trails. Every stop, every gas station, every motel, every repair shop left a ghost of their presence. Kincaid pinned the new reports onto his wall, stepping back to view the web. The pattern was undeniable now. The realtor case had expanded beyond one city, beyond one victim. It was a traveling script of predation, moving along highways like a storm system, vanishing and reappearing without warning. But storms always leave debris. And Kincaid believed that debris would one day lead him to the truth. He knew with a certainty that burned in his chest that the mask would not hold forever. Someone would see too much. Someone would remember a detail too sharp to dismiss. And when that happened, the silence would crack wide open. Until then, he carried the weight. The absence of Jessica, the fracture in the mask, the map of shadows stretching across the desert. He carried it because no one else would. And he carried it because he believed, with the stubbornness of obsession, that the predators who had stolen Jessica Hale were closer to their mistake than they realized. 2 years after Jessica Hale's disappearance, Albuquerque had reshaped itself around the silence she left behind. The subdivision where she vanished now stood complete, every lot filled, every sidewalk chalked by children who had never known her name. To newcomers, the neighborhood was just another slice of desert suburbia. But for those who had lived there long enough, the memory was woven into the stucco and asphalt. They spoke of it rarely, but it lived in them still. The night a young realtor walked into a house and never came back out. Detective Mark Kincaid had refused to let the silence be permanent. The case consumed him until it was the rhythm of his life. His office walls had become a landscape of threads, maps, photographs, and scribbled notes. He carried the weight like a vow. To most of the city, Jessica's story was a closed chapter, filed under the category of mysteries that never end. To him, it was unfinished, waiting for its final page. The cracks in the predator's mask had been widening for months. The reports from Phoenix, Las Cruces, Amarillo, each one a faint echo of the same couple rehearsing their roles, slipping across the desert under cover of politeness. The white sedan, the floral dress, the baseball cap. Always the same script, but repetition breeds mistakes. Kincaid believed the mask would break, and he was right. It began with a small-town deputy in West Texas. He had pulled over a white sedan late at night for a broken taillight. The driver, a tall man with dark hair under a cap, handed over an ID that felt wrong in his hand. The woman in the passenger seat remained silent, staring at her lap. The deputy ran the license. It came back to someone who had died years earlier. By the time he returned to the car, the sedan was gone, vanishing into the night like smoke. But he remembered the man's face enough to sketch it later, and when that sketch reached Kincaid's desk, recognition flared like fire. It was the face he had been chasing for 2 years, blurred in gas station footage, whispered in witness accounts. Now it was clear enough to hold. The FBI took the sketch, cross-referenced it against databases, and finally, a name surfaced, a drifter with a history of fraud, known for moving from state to state, never leaving roots. He had arrests for petty scams, stolen cars, forged documents, but nothing violent on record. Yet the pattern fit. He had always traveled with a woman, her identity shifting as often as his. No one had looked closely before. Now the pieces locked into place. With the name came records, motel check-ins, credit card fragments, pawn shop receipts. The predators had left more behind than they thought. A trail emerged across the Southwest, dotted with false identities, but consistent in shape. For the first time, the investigation had teeth. The break reinvigorated the case. Media returned, cameras chasing every update. Jessica's face appeared on screens again, her name spoken in the present tense. Her family clung to hope that answers were finally close. Ryan sat through briefings at the precinct, silent but present, his grief sharpened into something steadier. For Kincaid, the break was not relief, but pressure, the kind that comes when the end of a long hunt draws near. They tracked the couple to a small town in New Mexico, just hours from where Jessica had vanished. A motel clerk remembered them, polite, practiced, but hurried. The man had bought gas and food at a station nearby, caught briefly on camera once more. The woman lingered outside, staring at the road as if willing it to open. Every sighting matched the same uneasy choreography. His control, her silence. The trail narrowed. Surveillance cameras caught the white sedan moving west along I-40 toward Arizona. Alerts went out across counties. And then finally, a call came from a state trooper near Flagstaff. The car had been found, abandoned at the edge of a forest road, dust thick on its hood. Inside, investigators recovered maps marked with faint routes, motel receipts under false names, and scraps of handwritten notes. But what froze Kincaid was a single detail. In the trunk, they found traces of fabric fibers matching Jessica's clothing from the night she vanished. Proof that she had been there. Proof she had not simply dissolved into myth. The discovery hit like a storm. Media swarmed again. Her parents stood before cameras, voices trembling as they spoke of closure, of justice. But Kincaid felt the weight more heavily than ever. The predators were still out there. The abandoned car was not an end, but another mask discarded. They would move again, change again, vanish again, unless he caught them. The hunt stretched into weeks. Tips poured in from across the Southwest, sightings in diners, gas stations, motels. Each one was a thread, some fraying, some strong. Kincaid followed them all, chasing the couple through deserts and towns, feeling them always one step ahead. But cracks widened with each movement. The man's control frayed. Witnesses remembered the woman more clearly now. Her hesitation, her eyes darting toward exits, the way she seemed to want to speak but didn't. The mask was breaking, and with it came hope. In the end, the predators were cornered not by force, but by mistake. A stolen car left behind in Arizona, a pawnshop slip bearing a false name too close to a real one, a woman's trembling hand leaving a signature inconsistent with the one before. Small cracks, widening into collapse. The arrest came quietly, without the violence Kincaid had imagined during long nights of obsession. The man was taken into custody, defiant even as the mask fell. The woman came too, silent still, her role unclear. Accomplice, victim, or something blurred between. Investigators pressed for answers. She stared at the table, then at last whispered details only someone inside the house could have known. Jessica's fate emerged slowly, painfully, in fragments. The predators had lured her into the script they had rehearsed countless times, carried her into the night, and erased her from her own life. Where her body lay, the desert still held close, unwilling to give back everything. But the truth was no longer silence. For Jessica's family, it was not the ending they had prayed for, but it was an ending. For the community, it was a release of breath long held. For Kincaid, it was the closing of a wound he had carried for 2 years, though the scar would never fade. The realtor case did not vanish into myth. It became a story with weight, a warning etched into the desert. That safety can fracture in an instant, that predators can wear the mask of ordinary life, but also that silence is never permanent. Every secret slips eventually. Every mask cracks. And in the quiet spaces between, justice waits, patient as the desert itself.